of specific areas I want to talk about. And anyone who's interacted with me before, maybe come to some of my webinars or follows my work, will not be surprised that I've chosen these two particular topics to throw into the mix to stimulate some thinking about workplace laboratories and their learning culture and communities of practice. So I did some work last year with Nigel Payne from the UK, who wrote a book called Workplace Learning, How to Build a Culture of Continuous Employee Development. And we're going to do some more work together around this. We're in a bit of a campaign. And one of the things that I learned through Nigel's work, through his books, through working with him, was that certainly my view on what learning culture was really all about. And I think how people in many organizations, many learning professionals approach learning culture was that I was taking too narrow a view. And often when I talk to learning leaders, learning professionals about learning culture, and do you have a learning culture, what they go to or what they think about is if people are completing learning programs voluntarily, if they're doing things other than the mandatory stuff, if we're getting logins to, our LMS, our LinkedIn Learning, our Skillsoft, whatever, Go One, whatever platform you use with content, and if people are voluntarily pulling the stuff that we've created, the stuff that we've put out there, that's learning culture. But really, that's really scratching the surface. Learning culture is so much more than that. And we're underselling the potential of learning culture if that's as far as we allow ourselves to stretch our thinking about learning culture. And Nigel uses this analogy of a gyroscope. And he talks about gyroscopes in aircraft. And they're a piece of equipment. Aircraft all have several gyroscopes. And they're really important for navigation. And they're really important for keeping your aircraft from flying into things, flying into the sea, flying into mountains, particularly when visibility is low. So what a gyroscope does is it feeds back data and information to the pilot about the horizon and where the horizon is, so they can keep orientation and keep moving in the right direction and keep level, basically, and keep on track. And some of you may be familiar with spinning tops. I keep spinning tops handy. There you go. I've got a little spinning top here, little kids spinning tops. They're a form of gyroscope. And when you've just got them sitting there, like just as a piece of plastic or a lump of metal, they're nothing, right? They're just inert objects. They don't do anything. But when you start them spinning, there's like this energy to them. And they gain momentum and they've got this sense of direction. They'll move, and if you try to kind of flick them off path, they'll keep moving in the same direction. Or if you've got them on a surface, say on a breadboard or a piece of wood, and you tip the surface, they'll reorientate so that they maintain their bearing in relation to the horizon and the external environment. So the concept here is that if we have a learning culture, we become better at looking outside of the organisation, at sensing what's happening in the environment and adapting to that, and then bringing new knowledge into the organisation and using it to create the energy, to create the spin, to create the momentum in the organisation. So learning becomes like a source of energy in the organisation to keep the organisation moving forward. But it's only through creating this porosity, this openness to the outside world, and letting people go and explore and bring new ideas back into the organisation and try them out. If you like, to Amanda's point, about workplace laboratories being about being researchers of our own practice, to bring things back in, try them out, run experiments, reflect, and figure out what just happened. And is this something that is going to help us to keep moving forward and to adapting? So I'm constantly talking to people now about expanding your concept of what learning culture is and the possibilities of it. So this is Nigel's definition. So it's this dynamic process where you take insight from outside, you appropriate it, you adapt it, you share it across the organisation, but you take action with it, you do something with it. So you run the experiments, you use the workplace as your laboratory, and then the stuff that worked out well in terms of those experiments, the stuff you want to embed in your practice, you keep working with. And so I think there's a linkage to this idea of workplace laboratories. The other thing that's important to note here, and I know we'll have a lot of people on the call who are from the learning profession, is learning practitioners don't control all of everything that needs to happen for true learning cultures to be built. A lot of the environment or the conditions for people to be able to experiment, to have the safety to experiment, to use the workplace as a laboratory, if you like, and to take risks with their learning, to try something knowing it might not work out, it might not be perfect. A lot of that is built up through that second layer, where you see the boxes with trust, leadership, engagement, and empowerment. If those conditions aren't present in the organisation, in the broader culture, you're going to have trouble getting people to be experimental in their work. I know some people have been talking about Learning Uncut. There is an awesome episode coming out next Tuesday with Gary Ridge, who's the CEO of WD-40, about how they've built what the Harvard Business Review in an article called a learning obsessed culture. So if you're interested in learning culture, I would recommend you catch that episode. So there are plenty of examples of organisations that are building this kind of culture. I see lots of it in bits and pieces, in parts of an organisation or one or two practices, but some of these organisations on the screen, quite a few of whom feature in Nigel's book, but some I've picked up from elsewhere, they do have a range of practices that really promote this kind of experimentation. They encourage people to take risks. Microsoft is a classic example. If you look at their growth under Satya Nadella as CEO, and the approach that he personally has brought in, and this is the benefit of having a strong leader who really deeply gets learning. He has encouraged people to be, his own words, learn-it-alls rather than know-it-alls. And they've recently restructured all of their leadership training, a lot of their performance management processes around growth mindset. Shopify is another organization that's taken growth mindset and worked it right through many aspects of their complete end-to-end talent management cycle, from recruitment through to their learning processes and programs, and their promotion and succession planning. They look consciously for growth mindset and nurture growth mindset through the whole talent life cycle. So if it's relevant to the questions that come up in the chat, I'll share some of the examples from some of these organisations. But there's plenty of good case studies and examples that we can draw upon to look at what kind of culture could we be building to encourage the kind of experimentation that constitutes workplace laboratories. Communities of practice are something I've been an advocate of for about 5 years now. I first introduced them when I was working at Coca-Cola Amatil, when I kind of realised that we were doing 70-20-10, which I think most people here will be familiar with, but as a model towards organisational learning, it encourages to take a more holistic view of what learning might look like in organisations. So rather than just everything being about training, learning and taking people off the job, to look for the power of learning through as people work, either individually or collectively. And one of the practices we really picked up on once we realised at Coca-Cola Amatil that we were scratching the surface with 70-20-10. All we did initially was put some workplace-based learning activities into our formal programs, rather than really sitting back and saying, well, where can we let go of a bit of control and stop getting in the way, to Amanda's point again, and just do our job by connecting people to each other, by looking for the friction points that got in the way of people getting on with real learning, and try to remove some of those. And where we landed was with communities of practice, which is really just about finding people who are relevant to each other, who have some common interest in an area of practice and a common interest in improving that practice, and bringing them together. And also breaking down some of the barriers to allowing them to connect beyond the boundaries of the organisation, to connect externally, to bring in new ideas and to experiment with those. So I think where Amanda's talking about being researchers of our own practice, I think we can do that both individually as well as collectively in our work teams and in our communities of practice. And that reflective component is really important, to look for ways to build that into the flow of work, or into the way, if we are involved with facilitating and supporting and enabling communities of practice, some of the activities that go on in communities of practice. So there's a lot of ways that communities of practice can create value in an organisation. And this is drawn on the work of Harold Jarque as well as Etienne Wenger. I'm sorry, I didn't pull out specific references to the source of these two diagrams, but Harold Jarque and Etienne Wenger are well worth investigating if you're interested in communities. And you'll see on the left-hand side there, Harold's diagram, where he's got communities of practice as the linkage between social networks, particularly external networks, and work teams where the work gets done. And he's talking about their role in testing new ideas. I think they're just a great place to set up this idea of running experiments and trying out new ideas and seeing what happens. And in terms of the value creation through this approach, you know, there's all sorts of problem solving, all sorts of innovation, which can come out of working with a group of people as communities of practice. So that is what I wanted to seed into the conversation today. And we'll see where the questions take us. I see Matt's got a question on any tips about setting up a community of practice that are sustaining.